Both on This Old House and the new Yankee Workshop for years, we have always promoted safety in all aspects of what we do.
For 21 years, a man in plaid stood quietly in a small workshop and built furniture, alone, on camera, with no script, no second takes, and no safety net. Then one day, without warning, he walked away from one of the most beloved shows on television, and almost nobody knew why. Today we're going to talk about Norm Abram, the man behind the new Yankee Workshop, and the real story of why a show that millions of people loved, and that PBS would have happily run forever, simply stopped. Most people who watched television in the 80s and 90s remember the new Yankee Workshop as a kind of background comfort. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have a competition format or a countdown clock or a panel of judges. It was just a man named Norm Abram, walking into a wood-paneled workshop in Massachusetts, putting on his safety glasses, and building something from start to finish. A blanket chest, a rocking chair, a garden shed. Whatever the project was, you watched him measure, cut, sand, and assemble it, often while explaining exactly what he was doing and why, in a calm, unhurried voice that felt like it belonged to your favorite uncle. The show was created in the late 80s by producer Russell Morash, who also created This Old House, the renovation series that had already made Norm a familiar face to American audiences. Morash had spent years watching Norm work as the lead carpenter on that show, and he noticed something that television rarely captures: a person who is simply excellent at a craft and who can explain that craft in a way that makes ordinary viewers feel like they could try it themselves. So Morash built Norm his own stage, a workshop behind a New England farmhouse, stocked with tools, and let him do what he did best. What followed was more than 2 decades of episodes that, on the surface, looked almost identical to each other. Norm would introduce a project, sometimes visiting a historic home or museum to study an original piece of furniture, and then return to the shop to build his own version of it. There was no dramatic music, no manufactured conflict, no guest stars. And yet the show became a staple of public television, watched by hobbyists, retirees, students, and entire families who would gather around the television on Saturday mornings. Over the run of the series, Norm built roughly 235 complete projects on screen. Some were simple shop aids, jigs and fixtures meant to make future projects easier. Others were ambitious reproductions of museum pieces, accurate down to the joinery techniques used centuries earlier. There were outdoor structures, garden furniture, even a small sailboat built over the course of several episodes. For woodworkers, the show became something close to a syllabus. For non-woodworkers, it became something closer to therapy, a half hour where nothing bad happened and someone competent simply solved a problem with their hands. But here's the thing that almost nobody talked about while the show was on the air. What you were watching on screen was a tiny fraction of the actual work involved. A single episode, only about 22 minutes of finished footage, could require somewhere between 40 and 60 hours of preparation and filming. Before a single board was cut, someone had to source the right lumber, often specific species and dimensions, and inspect it for the kind of flaws that would ruin a finished piece. Someone had to plan out the entire build in a way that could actually be filmed, figuring out which steps needed to be shown in detail and which could be compressed. Cameras had to be positioned, so they wouldn't get in Norm's way while he was operating table saws, planers, and chisels. And in the middle of all that planning, Norm still had to build the thing. Not a stunt double, not a stand-in for the dangerous parts. Norm, every cut, every joint, every mistake and correction, was real, happening in real time, with real tools that don't forgive carelessness. He had one assistant on set who mostly helped with cleanup and finishing work, but the actual craftsmanship that people tuned in for was entirely his. That authenticity is part of why the show worked so well. Anyone who has ever picked up a chisel can tell, almost instantly, whether the person on screen actually knows what they are doing or whether they are performing for a camera. Norm clearly knew what he was doing. There was a kind of quiet authority in the way he held tools, the way he talked through a tricky cut before making it, the way he occasionally paused to fix something that hadn't gone quite right. It felt less like watching a television host and more like standing in a shop next to someone who had been doing this their entire life, because that's exactly what it was. At the same time, Norm wasn't only working on the new Yankee Workshop. For most of its run, he was also still appearing on This Old House, which had its own filming schedule. So for years, Norm Abram was essentially doing two demanding jobs in television at once. On This Old House, he was an important contributor, but one voice among several, sharing the work with hosts, contractors, and other tradespeople. On the new Yankee Workshop, he was everything: the designer, the builder, the teacher, and the host, all in one person, every single episode. And then there was the workshop itself. It was a real working shop, which meant a concrete floor. During filming seasons, Norm would be on his feet on that concrete for 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours a day. Not occasionally, not for a few weeks out of the year, for more than 2 decades. Anyone who has worked a physically demanding job for years knows what that kind of repetition does to a body over time, even when you're careful, even when you know what you're doing. By the time the show reached its later seasons, Norm Abram was approaching 60 years old. He had spent roughly 20 years doing repetitive physical labor, sewing, chiseling, sanding, lifting, on a surface that was never designed with comfort in mind. The effects of that kind of work don't show up overnight. They build slowly, year after year, until eventually they are impossible to ignore. Joint pain from thousands of repetitive motions. Back strain from years of bending over workbenches and hauling lumber. Foot and heel pain from standing on hard concrete for the better part of every working day. The kind of chronic issue that physical therapists see constantly in people who spend their careers on their feet. None of that ever showed up on camera. Norm wasn't the type to complain on air, and the show wasn't built around personal drama, so viewers had no reason to think anything had changed. The work in the final seasons looked just as careful and unhurried as it had in the very first ones. But behind the scenes, by most accounts, there had already been quiet conversations between Norm Russell Morash and the people at WGBH, the Boston Public Broadcasting station that produced the show, about what continuing would actually require, and what it would cost. This is really the heart of the story, and it's worth saying clearly, the show did not end because of declining ratings. It did not end because of a feud, a scandal, a contract dispute, or pressure from the network. In the years since the series concluded, there's been the usual swirl of online speculation that tends to follow any long-running show's ending, theories about behind-the-scenes tension or creative disagreements. But the people closest to the production have been consistent on this point. There was no external force pushing Norm out, and the show was never cancelled in the way people usually mean that word. It simply reached a natural ending point, on Norm's own terms. Norm himself addressed it in characteristically understated fashion, describing the run as a great one, full of challenging projects, interesting people, and loyal viewers, and treating the ending as simply the natural conclusion of something that had run its course. There was no list of grievances, no finger-pointing at producers or the network, just an acknowledgement that it was time to move on. Russell Morash, who had been involved with the show from its earliest planning stages, put it simply, in the sense that the show could not really continue without Norm at the center of it. This wasn't a format that could be handed off to a new host, the way some long-running programs rotate personalities. The entire concept depended on one specific person, doing a specific kind of work, in a specific way. Once that person decided he had given what he could give to the project, there really wasn't another version of the show to make. There's also a detail that tends to get lost in summaries of the ending, which is that Norm had his own unfinished projects waiting for him. He had built his own home, a timber-framed colonial house in Carlisle, Massachusetts, largely with his own hands, and there were details and additions he had wanted to get to for years but never had time for, because so much of his time and energy went into the show every season. Stepping away from the new Yankee Workshop wasn't really stepping away from woodworking at all. In a lot of ways, it was the opposite. It was finally creating space to do woodworking for himself, on his own schedule, without a film crew and a production calendar shaping every decision. When WGBH announced in the fall of 2009 that no further episodes would be produced, there wasn't a big farewell special or an emotional final episode built around saying goodbye. The announcement itself was fairly low-key, which, if you think about it, was completely in character for a show that had never relied on spectacle in the first place. It ended quietly, the same way it had been made for 21 years. Even so, the reaction from longtime viewers was bigger than a lot of people expected. It wasn't that fans assumed the show would run forever. Most people understand that television programs eventually end. What surprised people was that there hadn't been any obvious warning signs. No noticeable drop in quality, no sense of a final season being treated differently, nothing that read as a goodbye. The show had simply been doing what it always did, and then it stopped. Woodworking publications and online forums saw an unusually strong response to the news. People weren't just expressing mild disappointment the way you might about any cancelled show. Many described the series as something that had genuinely shaped how they spent their free time for years. Experienced woodworkers talked about how the show had reignited an interest in the craft that they'd let slide. Beginners talked about how watching Norm work through a project, step by step, had given them the confidence to attempt their first real build. Some viewers wrote about watching the show with their kids, who were now adults, and who still remembered specific projects from those Saturday mornings. What that response really revealed was something the ratings numbers alone never fully captured. The new Yankee Workshop hadn't just been entertainment that people half-watched on a weekend. For a lot of people, it had genuinely influenced how they thought about making things, the value of doing careful work, and how they spent their time off. That's an unusual thing for any television show to achieve, especially one that never tried to generate buzz or controversy in the first place. And importantly, the overall tone of the reaction wasn't anger. There was real sadness, but it was the kind of sadness that comes with understanding and respect. Even without knowing the specific physical toll involved, many longtime viewers seemed to sense that Norm had given an enormous amount to that show for a very long time, and that there wasn't really anything left to ask for. Looking back now, the legacy of the show is a little unusual, because it never tried to build one in any loud way. It didn't generate headlines or controversy while it was airing, and it hasn't generated much since. It just quietly did its job, week after week, for 21 years, and in doing so it shaped how a lot of people think about craftsmanship. The projects themselves have aged remarkably well. Shaker-style furniture, Windsor chairs, blanket chests, bookcases, classic reproductions. These aren't styles that feel dated, because they were never about trends in the first place. They are designs that have lasted for generations because the construction is honest, without shortcuts hidden under decoration. Norm didn't just show people how to build these pieces. He explained why those particular designs had endured, which is a different kind of lesson than just demonstrating technique. For years, the show also offered detailed plans for many of its projects, giving viewers a direct path from watching an episode to building the same piece themselves, with the same dimensions and joinery. A lot of those pieces are still in people's homes today, some of them now being passed down to a second generation within the same family, which is a strange and wonderful kind of legacy for a television show to have. More than a decade after the show ended, all of its episodes became available to watch for free online, and the response from a new audience was almost identical to the original one. People in their 20s and 30s discovered Norm Abram for the first time, and reacted with the same kind of quiet appreciation that earlier generations had. Comments described staying up late watching episode after episode, picking up basic woodworking tools for the first time, and finding the show oddly calming compared to a lot of other content online. More than a decade after it stopped airing, the show was still doing exactly what it had always done, quietly making people want to go build something. As for Norm himself, ending the new Yankee Workshop didn't mean stepping away from television or from woodworking altogether. He continued appearing on This Old House, but in a role that was far more sustainable, contributing his expertise without carrying the entire production on his own. He also finally had time for his own home in Carlisle, the one he built himself years earlier, working on it at his own pace, without a film crew or deadline. He continued writing as well, in the same clear, practical style that had defined his television work, and appeared in a documentary focused on giving new life to fallen urban trees, which fit naturally with how he'd always talked about wood, not just as a material, but as something with its own history. Eventually, after several decades on television, Norm officially retired from This Old House too, in a similarly understated way, without any big send-off. By most accounts, the original workshop is still standing, and Norm still visits it from time to time, not to film anything, just to build. So when you put all of this together, the real reason the new Yankee Workshop ended isn't complicated, and it isn't a story about a falling out or a cancellation. It's a story about a man who gave a huge amount of physical effort to a show for 21 years, doing real work, the hard way, with no shortcuts, and who eventually recognized that he'd given what he had to give, and chose to stop on his own terms, without making it into a big production. No dramatic farewell, No extended goodbye season, just a quiet decision to step away and keep building, just without the cameras. If you found this story interesting, there are plenty more like it. Stories about the people and shows that quietly shaped a lot more than we usually give them credit for. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.